of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Procurement and Military Nuclear Systems. Members are meeting today to consider the A-12 stealth bomber program. The jet is scheduled to be ready in the mid-1990s and is meant to replace the A-6 attack bomber that's deployed in the Persian Gulf. Last week, the Navy fired 2 top officials charged with managing the development of the A-12. In this hearing, the witnesses include Navy Secretary H. Lawrence Garrett III, Defense Department Inspector General Mike Sussman, Navy Inspector General Susan Crawford, and Navy Special Inquiry Officer Chester Beach, Jr.
Hearing will come to order. Today we have brought together the Procurement, Research and Development and Investigation subcommittees to consider the A-12 program. The last time we had testimony about the program was on April 26th last spring, when Defense Secretary Dick Cheney presented his major aircraft review. There was nothing in that testimony to signal serious problems in the A-12 program. Then, only 5 weeks after that testimony, on about the 1st of June, we learned 2 very disturbing things. First of all, that the cost growth of more than $1 billion over the ceiling price of the full-scale development contract was being projected. And secondly, the schedule was expected to slip by more than 18 months. So we're here to examine those issues and ask what went wrong and why top Pentagon officials did not know about it. It's worth noting that this program that had all the ingredients that are supposed to spell success. First, there is a valid, widely recognized military requirement for this system. Second, it was a special access program virtually immune from micromanagement. And third, it was fully funded in its development. Now the projected full-scale development cost of the program is up more than 20%. The program schedule has slipped badly, and there is serious question as whether the contractors can meet their financial obligations under the contract. This hearing marks the first time we will be able to examine this program in depth and on the public record. There's a lot of questions that we want to examine with this question, in particular, questions such as why did this occur, what caused the cost overrun, what caused the delay. But mainly, this is the first of a series of hearings on the subject, and the purpose of this hearing is, of course, to examine the issue of why was it that the people who were doing the major aircraft review did not know about this issue 5 weeks before it became public. And that is a very disturbing issue, and that, of course, is the purpose of our hearings today with the Secretary of the Navy and the people, Paul Beach, the people who put together that report, and then the Inspector General's report. They really have looked at that issue, and basically that's the subject of today's hearings, to examine the question of information flow and why was it that this information was not available to the chief decision makers in the Pentagon. And our first panel of witnesses today includes Larry Garrett, the Secretary of the Navy, and Paul Beach, the Special Counsel to the Secretary, who conducted the inquiry into the program that we will hear about today. Our second panel, we will have Mr. Secretary and Mr. Beach, if it's all right with you, we'll do your hearing and then have members ask questions after your statement. Then we will have a second panel, which will include Susan Crawford, the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, and members of her staff. Welcome to all of you, and let me see who else has a statement. Mr. Dellums, who's the chairman of the R&D subcommittee, will make a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and members of the respective panels. I have a fairly brief opening statement. Mr. Chairman, the Navy's A-12 program has been billed as the service's highest priority aviation program. The program entered full-scale development in January of 1988. It has enjoyed strong congressional support and has been fully funded from its inception. I believe that everyone will agree that management interference in this program by the Congress has been minimal. The program should have been a model of defense research and development programs. Yet today, Mr. Chairman, we find the program with a projected overrun of more than $1.3 billion, above the targeted full-scale development cost of $4.4 billion, and a projected slip in the date of the first flight for the A-12 of nearly 18 months. Less than 3 years after beginning full-scale development, I find this information most disturbing. and particularly so when there were apparently indications of program delays within 6 months after the program began full-scale development. Further, Mr. Chairman, we have been advised that the program manager and program executive officer have been removed from the program and indeed censured. The commander, Naval Air Systems Command, have been ordered to retire early. Errors in judgment, failure to ensure adequate oversight, and failure to inform the Navy acquisition executive fully as cited as the basis for these actions by the Secretary of the Navy. The Department of Defense Inspector General has expressed concern about the failure of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition to exercise what, in her view, was a necessary degree of skepticism in accepting general assurances of program health from the contractor. Mr. Chairman, what is it that got us into this fix that brings us to this moment? Why and how did the Navy's highest priority aviation program get into trouble? What factors led serving military officers and civilians who have outstanding records to make the mistakes that are alleged? Is it our development program and the way we manage it at fault, or did people make honest mistakes? Did the project manager and his military superiors become so wedded to ensuring the success of the A-12 that they failed to recognize the problems of cost, performance, and schedule until it was too late? Why did they not immediately advise their civilian leadership of these problems? Why didn't the Office of the Secretary of Defense discover these problems sooner and do something about them? Is there something inherent in the way the Department of Defense runs so-called special access programs? And I might add parenthetically, both you and I and others have raised the question of what is the potential abuse of programs staying in the secret, in the dark for so long in special access categories, denying adequate oversight. What prevents effective oversight from being exercised by the department's civilian leadership? We must indeed seek answers to these questions in the weeks and months ahead as we review what went wrong in the A-12 program. Mr. Chairman, we have begun a major review of how we do military research and development in this country in light of the reduction of the Soviet threat in Europe, the situation in the Middle East, the potential for threats to U.S. interests in other parts of the world, and the constrained budget environment within which we find ourselves. The results of our investigation of the A-12 program, in my opinion, will be most important to that review and the future of military research and development. I'd like to thank you for suggesting that we call these hearings. I certainly pledge, as chair of the Subcommittee on Research and Development, that we will pursue beyond this moment this investigation vigorously. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as we begin this most important investigation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Dellums. Let me ask Bob Davis, who is the ranking Republican on the Procurement Subcommittee, for a few words.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a statement that I'd like to submit on behalf of Mr. Dickinson, too.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I imagine today's is the first of several hearings that we will hold on the ramifications of both Mr. Bish's inquiry and Mrs. Crawford's quick reaction audit of recent events concerning the A-12. Though there may be some who will be looking for a smoking gun, I would caution and remind ourselves that our function is not to fix individual blame and mete out punishment. Rather, our task, as I see it, is twofold. One, to determine whether the process of program management controls failed, and if so, what actions we should take to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And number two, to ascertain the programmatic impact of the developments that have occurred since the contractors announced the FSD contract price would be significantly overrun and the scheduled first flight had slipped at least another 6 months from the date publicized in the major aircraft review. It is most unfortunate that we find ourselves where we are today, especially since the A-12 program has been, as has been mentioned here, has enjoyed unwavering support from this committee and indeed the entire Congress. However, I'm not sure any of us knows exactly the circumstances that have led to our being here. So assuming we need to get the facts on the record, I certainly welcome our witnesses today. and look forward to their testimony and hopefully answering a lot of questions that this committee might have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Let me just also say for the record, there will be statements from Mr. Mavroulis and from Mr. Hopkins that will be. Did you want to say something again? Oh, okay. Mr. Mavroulis and Mr. Hopkins statements will be put in the record. And now let us turn to the witnesses. Let me just say that the Secretary of the Navy last week, a lot of the questions that we're asking also were of concern to the Secretary of the Navy, who ordered a study that Mr. Paul Beach is the author of, and so they're here to talk about their study, which they released last week, and took some pretty drastic personnel actions last week too. Mr. Secretary, we're here to try and get to the bottom of these things, and as I say, we're mainly interested at this hearing in the question of the information flow. Other hearings, we will look at the question of how did the cost overrun occur and how did the delay occur. What we're interested mainly in this hearing is how come nobody at the top of the Pentagon knew about it, because clearly a $1 billion cost overrun and an 18-month delay does not occur in a 5-week period. The poor Secretary of Defense must have been very much embarrassed by having come here on the 26th of April and stating, at least implying or stating that the program was well in hand, only to find 5 weeks later that it was far from well in hand. Andy Ireland, did you have something to say?
Well, I did, Mr. Chairman, and ordinarily I'd asked to have my statement put in, but I would like to read it in that based on our initial statements here, I think it perhaps would flesh out some things that would help later on. I do want to thank you for responding so quickly to my request to have these hearings. And indeed, we are here this afternoon to gain more information concerning a report that I requested last June from the Inspector General concerning those cost overruns and the development contract. That report was presented to me on November 29th by the Inspector General, documents at least $1 billion in cost overruns. Some independent analysts have estimated the total overruns could reach as high as $4 billion. And I believe that kind of background should be important to us in these hearings. I've been concerned for some time now that the information cost overruns on the A-12 program was being deliberately suppressed by the Navy and ignored by the Office of Secretary of Defense. I voiced these concerns to Deputy Inspector General Derek Vanderschaft during a meeting in June of this year, in which I asked for this investigation, a report of which is part of our record today. I'd like to take this opportunity to commend the Inspector General and everyone on her staff who was involved in the A-12 inquiry. They all deserve special praise for some excellent work. The IG's investigation, along with the inquiry initiated by the Navy only several weeks later, has brought to light some basic fundamental flaws in program accountability at the Department of Defense. It is now up to us to get to the heart of this problem once and for all. The facts contained in the IG and Navy reports reveal a virtual breakdown of independent cost estimating procedures at the Pentagon, procedures that are required by law. I'm concerned that there may have even been criminal behavior on the part of the Navy and Department of Defense officials. In fact, I have asked the IG to look into this possibility as well. Mr. Chairman, it's quite obvious that the cost estimating at the Pentagon is in shambles. In the case of the A-12, the process has failed completely. Quite simply, there are no independent sources of cost information available to the Secretary of Defense on the program. The consequences of that failure were made all too clear earlier in this year. The Secretary of Defense, in his testimony presented in April before our full committee, after the Navy's major aircraft review, gave the A-12 a clean bill of health. Some 2 weeks later, contractors on the A-12 made public what had been common knowledge to Navy program managers since early 1989. The A-12 was substantially over budget and a year behind schedule. Why was the Secretary of Defense the last to know that this program was in trouble? Aside from the embarrassment that you mentioned, this whole episode must have caused the Secretary. It raises some serious questions. At this critical time in the military defense of our country, how can he make informed decisions about our country's defense if his own OSD staff fails to provide him with information that substantially affects those decisions? What other essential facts are being withheld, either deliberately or through serious lack of judgment by very senior people in the services and at OSD? I'm also concerned that those who are directly responsible for this A-12 debacle are not being held accountable for their actions. And particularly it troubles me that the Navy plans to promote Captain Elberfeld, the program manager of A-12 aircraft program, who was recently censured by the Secretary of the Navy for failing to inform his superiors that the A-12 was several years behind schedule and several $1 billion over contract ceiling. Why is the Navy moving to promote this man at the same time they're censuring him? What kind of message does this send about the seriousness of the Navy's commitment to clean up this contracting process? Mr. Chairman, I believe it is the wrong message. Therefore, I've written to President Bush asking him to remove Captain Elberfeld's name from the list of officers to be promoted to Rear Admiral. This experience with the A-12 is not an isolated incident that can be fixed by slapping the wrists of an admiral or two. What we are dealing with is a long-standing DOD and service-wide problem, one that has existed perhaps 20 or 30 years. There are many examples, the most recent being the B-1, as we know. The program managers in that case managed to conceal cost overruns in that program by drawing on expired spending authority retained in the department's M accounts, a $50 billion Pentagon slush fund that the Congress finally shut down this year's defense authorization bill. We know that the M account can no longer be used for this purpose in the future, but I can't help wondering how many other program overruns were solved in a similar fashion in the past without Congress's knowledge. Perhaps the A-12 was headed in that direction. Clearly, we need answers. If a lone analyst in the Secretary's office was able to identify $1 billion in cost overruns one day after being granted access to the program, how could everyone else have missed the problem completely? And why were bonuses, awards, and promotions being handed out despite all these problems? Perhaps we can begin to shed some light on these questions this afternoon. This is a very important hearing. Questions are there about information flow and indeed questions concerning poor judgment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is this on? All right, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Dellums, members of the subcommittees. I appreciate this opportunity to review with you the Department of the Navy's inquiry into certain aspects of the Navy's management of the A-12 full-scale development program and the actions which we have taken and are taking in response to the inquiry's findings and recommendations. As was pointed out with me is Mr. Paul Beach, my Principal Deputy General Counsel, who conducted the inquiry as I directed. As you know, the A-12 has been and remains the Navy's #1 aviation priority since its inception in 1984. It is intended to meet the critical and unquestionable requirement to replace and modernize the Navy's medium attack aviation force. During my service as Undersecretary of the Navy and since my appointment as Secretary, I sought and I received a number of briefings over time from the Navy Program Management Team regarding the program's status and particular program issues. And while those briefings identified numerous challenges that came up from time to time, they gave no indication that the contract would not be completed within its ceiling price. Nor did those briefings indicate that first flight and the follow-on test program would not be achieved and completed in a sufficiently timely manner to support an IOC, that is the initial operational capability, for the A-12 in 1994, as was directed by the Deputy Secretary of Defense in 1984. During the major aircraft review conducted from January through March of this year, both the Navy Program Management Team and program corporate officials from the General Dynamics McDonnell Douglas team projected the completion of contract at or within ceiling, and that first flight would take place no later than March of 1991. On June 1, however, the contractor team informed us that first flight of the A-12 would not occur before September of 1991, that the cost of the full-scale development effort would overrun the ceiling price of the contract by an amount which the contractors could not absorb, and that certain performance specifications in the contract could not be met. To be very frank, I was stunned by that revelation, for this was a dramatic change from the representations which had been made by my own management team and by the contractors during the major aircraft review less than 90 days before. On June 12th, Mr. Gary Crystal, a member of the OSD staff, came up and briefed me in some detail regarding cost performance data submitted to the Navy Program Management Team periodically throughout the performance of the contract. He estimated on the basis of these data that the contract would indeed overrun the ceiling by $1 billion or more, and of his opinion that these data should have indicated a cost risk of this magnitude to the program management team as much as a year before the major aircraft review. I simply couldn't reconcile the contractor's presentation nor Mr. Crystal's analysis with the program as it had been consistently presented to me by the Navy Program Management Team. Accordingly, I formally directed Mr. Beach to conduct an administrative inquiry within the Department of the Navy to determine the reason for the difference between the program status presented to me and other senior leaders prior to and during the major aircraft review and that which was portrayed by the contractor team so shortly thereafter. In making his analysis, findings, and recommendations, I directed Mr. Beach to focus upon accountability as well as systemic changes or improvements needed to ensure that senior leaders are provided timely, accurate information in the future. At Undersecretary Betty's request, Mr. Beach also examined the major aircraft review process within the Office of the Secretary of Defense with respect to the current status of the A-12 program. Mr. Chairman, I ask that the full text of Mr. Beach's report, as endorsed in my memorandum forwarding it to Secretary Cheney, be entered into the record.
Without objection.
With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I would ask Mr. Beach now to summarize the findings and the recommendations contained in his report, and then I will conclude by describing the actions taken in response to it.
Mr. Beach.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, as Secretary Garrett indicated, my charter was twofold. First, within the Navy, to determine the reasons for the significant variance between the status of the program as understood prior to and during the major aircraft review, and then later as revealed by the contractors in June of this year. Second, within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, to examine the major aircraft review process to determine why it did not identify the cost and schedule status of the program independently. I'd like to stress one point at the outset. Although there is some evidence in my report which refers to technical issues, my inquiry was not a technical review of the program. Therefore, one should not draw any inference regarding the current technical status of the program from the information contained in my report. In order to fulfill my charter, I established an inquiry support team of auditors, investigators, and experts drawn from the Naval Audit Service, the Naval Inspector General's Office, the Office of the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, the Defense Product Engineering Services Office, and the Defense Contract Management Command. In the course of the inquiry, we spent a week visiting both contractor facilities in St. Louis and Fort Worth, Texas. We interviewed more than 60 Navy, contractor, and OSD personnel, and we reviewed in excess of 10,000 pages of program documentation. I conducted the analysis in two stages. First, I sought to identify the principal program management controls which might provide visibility into the cost and schedule status of a contract. First, to see how they are intended to operate, that is, to see if they should have identified the problem if properly operated, and then, having ascertained that, to see how they actually operated and assess why they failed if they did in this case. Second, I sought to analyze the MAR process, the Major Aircraft Review process, in light of the information environment created within the Navy and within the Office of the Secretary of Defense by the operation of those regular program control mechanisms. In conducting this analysis, we identified three principal program control mechanisms which bear upon cost and schedule issues in the performance of current contracts. The cost performance reporting mechanism, engineering and manufacturing oversight, principally through plant representative offices on site at contractor facilities, and the process of contract administration itself, specifically in this case the administration of progress payments and payments for completion of line items under the contract. As a general matter, I found that these controls, had they been properly operated according to current Navy and Department of Defense policy, would have been sufficient to identify the problems in the performance of this contract prior to the major aircraft review. Let me briefly describe each of these mechanisms and summarize my findings with respect to them. With regard first to the cost performance reporting system, major contractors for the Department of Defense are required to maintain internal management systems which are compliant with cost and schedule control system criteria which are prescribed by the Department of Defense. On major contracts, such as in this case, they're required to report cost and schedule status periodically. Each report contains several levels of analysis. Cost and schedule variances are reported at the total program level. They are also reported by functional categories such as tooling and engineering, which are laid out to describe the way in which the contractor performs the work. And they're also reported according to what are called work breakdown structures, which are established as part of the contract itself and which are described with reference to the various parts of the product being produced, such as in this case the right outer wing, the left inner wing, the fuselage, and so forth. Each such report also contains a problem analysis, which explains the source as the contractor sees it of the major variances in cost and schedule. This information has utility to both contractors and the government in at least two respects. First of all, to identify and solve performance problems, and also as a basis for deriving estimates of cost to complete the contract. Government program managers are required to make an estimate of cost to complete the contract at least quarterly in the Defense Acquisition Executive Summary, which is prepared at the program office and is forwarded through channels at the Navy Department to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and which gives senior Navy and DoD officials the opportunity to evaluate ongoing program status between milestone decisions. In this case, we found that both contractors maintain systems which comply with the cost and schedule control system criteria established by DoD, and that both of these systems were reporting good quality data throughout the performance of the contract. The contractors in this case reported quarterly from June of 1988 and monthly since February of 1989. From the outset, these reports reflected significant continuing cost and schedule overruns in the performance of the contract. On the contractor side, this data was used for problem analysis, but the contractor estimates at completion, which were reported to the government, appeared to be based on the assumed benefits of recovery plans developed in response to the variances, rather than on an historical or parametric analysis simply of the negative variance data itself. And as the contract performance proceeded, these anticipated benefits did not in fact occur. On the government side, the program manager and his staff analyzed the cost performance reports at the total contract level, principally as input for the program manager's estimates at completion reported in the day's reports. However, they were not fully used as a problem analysis tool, either at the program management office level or in the NAVPRO and the AFPRO at the contractor facilities. With regard to the estimates at completion, I found that through errors of judgment and process failures within Naval Air Systems Command, the program manager underestimated the future implications of adverse cost and schedule trends in the estimates of completion that he reported both in the day's reports and his program briefs. They were higher than the contractor estimates, but nonetheless they were too optimistic. As a final point, with regard to cost performance reporting, I found that normal cost and schedule performance oversight reports were not prepared, nor did the Office of Secretary of Defense cost analysts conduct their normal review of CPR data as forwarded in the day's reports for reasons which are associated with the special access nature of the program. Let me turn now to the second thing that we looked at, engineering and manufacturing oversight. Under Department of Defense policy, the NAVPRO, the Naval Plant Representative Office at St. Louis, and the Air Force Plant Representative Office at Fort Worth should have functioned as the program manager's eyes and ears on site at the contractor facility to identify, assess, and help resolve performance problems under the contract. I would note that since the 1st of July of this year, these offices have been renamed Defense Plant Representative Offices and are now field activities of the Defense Contract Management Command. So they're not part of the Navy or the Air Force at this time. Ideally, the on-scene perspective provided by these experts, taken together with the cost performance reporting data, would have assisted the program manager in developing a realistic assessment of program status and the program prospects. However, in this case, as described in the report, neither the NAVPRO nor the AFPRO functioned as effectively as they should have to support the program manager in challenging the contractors. Finally, with respect to contract administration, discussions with contractor personnel during our visits to St. Louis and Fort Worth indicated that there was a perception on the part of both contractor program management teams at the program management level that there was significant pressure from corporate headquarters to maintain cash flow throughout the performance of the contract. I proceeded on the basis of that information to sort of establish a null hypothesis that had the contract been administered in the disciplined manner required by Navy and DoD policy, the delays in physical progress would have created delays in obtaining progress payments that might have forced the visibility of the performance problems up to a senior management level. In assessing whether that was the case or not, we found, and it's detailed in the report, that deficient performance by contracting and other personnel led to over-progressing on the contract and also to payments for several line items under the contract which were not completed at the time that payment was made. The net result was that the administration of the contract did not provide the visibility that it should have and might have into the performance problems in the contract. Against this environment of information, we then proceeded to take a look at the major aircraft review process. And I found that notwithstanding the Secretary of Defense's stated desire for a top-to-bottom review, the major aircraft review at the working group level focused primarily on requirements, alternatives, and total program costs rather than current program status. The major aircraft review did evaluate this program as being of moderate to high risk and did note that composite producibility was a potential driver of additional costs. And of course, you're aware of the late-breaking Office of Secretary of Defense estimate, which Secretary Garrett referred to in his testimony from Mr. Crystal, that highlighted the problem in early April. One additional issue that I should note, the evidence during my inquiry led to an additional finding that the Program Executive Officer for Tactical Programs and a member of the Navy Acquisition Executive Staff failed in their responsibilities to inform the Navy Acquisition Executive fully regarding relevant cost schedule and technical information in connection with his decision to exercise the Lot 1 production option under the contract, and in any event prior to the contractor's presentation on 1 June, which revealed the rough magnitude of the problems that we perceive at the present time. Let me summarize briefly in conclusion the types of recommendations that are contained in the report. The report contains 11 recommendations addressed to the Undersecretary of Defense for acquisition, 6 to the Navy Acquisition Executive, I believe, and 2 to the Secretary of the Navy. They fall into 2 types. With respect to accountability, I recommended to the Secretary of the Navy that he take appropriate administrative and/or disciplinary action with regard to the program manager, the program executive officer, and the commander of Naval Air Systems Command, and I made a similar recommendation to the Navy Acquisition Executive regarding the member of his staff I mentioned a moment ago. I also recommended that the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition assess accountability, if any, among members of his staff based on his perceptions as a senior manager of whether the staff process operated appropriately within his organization, and that he refer information from the report to the Commander of Defense Contract Management Command and to the head of the Defense Contract Audit Agency via the OSD Comptroller with regard to performance deficiencies that we identified in personnel assigned to those organizations. I made a number of recommendations with regard to process. I recommended that both at the Navy level and at the OSD level that the Defense Acquisition Executive Summary Report be modified in ways designed to ensure that program managers provide realistic estimates at completion as they report the status of the ongoing contracts on a quarterly basis. I recommended a review of the operation of program controls in all special access programs, both at the Navy level and at the USDA level. I recommended that the Navy Department conduct a lessons learned seminar arising out of this circumstance for all key program management personnel, program executive officers, and the like within the Navy. That actions be taken to reinforce the authority and accountability of program managers and program executive officers. And finally, that the USDA, the service secretaries, and the service acquisition executives focus specially on developing positive incentives to encourage line managers to be realistic about risk in programs as they proceed. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my summary. With your permission, I'll turn it back to Secretary Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Paul. Mr. Chairman, in response to each of the recommendations contained in the report, we in the Navy have initiated the following actions. I would like to go over them, if I may. First, we have directed that the A-12 program manager report now directly to the Navy acquisition executive rather than through a program executive officer, as has been done heretofore. We're also developing a charter for a comprehensive review of the operation of program management controls in each of our special acquisition programs. As Paul pointed out, we're in the process of developing a lessons learned seminar for all program executive officers, all program managers, and key personnel, focused on the responsibility and the accountability for reporting of accurate assessments of program status and risk to higher authority, independent of contractor representations. We are revitalizing the cost performance analysis as a management and oversight tool within the Department of the Navy. Changes in the Department of the Navy inputs to the Defense Acquisition Executive Summary, the DAYS report, to which Mr. Beach referred, to ensure that realistic estimates of cost and schedule status are provided to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and his staff. We're reviewing the administration of progress payments within the Department's major buying commands to ensure adherence to current policy and identify any needed changes. And we are reviewing the implementation of the Defense Management Report within Naval Air Systems Command to ensure that supported program executive officers and their program managers are receiving adequate support and have decision authority commensurate with their responsibility and their accountability. Additionally, I have forwarded the 11 recommendations Mr. Beach referred to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition for his review and further action on a department-wide basis. Finally, Mr. Chairman, in response to the report's recommendation regarding Navy personnel, Vice Admiral Gentz, the Commander of Naval Air Systems Command, has requested retirement effective 1 February 1990, and I will approve that request. I have censured Rear Admiral Calvert, the Program Executive Officer, for the performance deficiencies identified in the report, and he will be reassigned to new duties in the near future. I have also censured Captain Elberfeld, the Program Manager, for what I consider to be errors in judgment. His reassignment after 4.5 years as Program Manager, which was previously scheduled and approved by me to take place after first flight, will now take place in the near future. A formal notice of deficient performance, the equivalent of a letter of reprimand for members of the Senior Executive Service, has been issued to Mr. Robert Thompson, a member of the Navy Acquisition Executive Staff, for performance deficiencies identified in the report. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Dellums, this concludes my prepared statement. Mr. Beach and I would be pleased to address any questions you may have or any questions that the distinguished members of the committee may have.
Secretary Garrett, thank you very much for your report, and Paul Beach, thank you for your summary of your report. Let me ask a question, because I've had a chance to read Mr. Beach's report, and in response to what's in that report and what you're saying to me today, just to try and identify wherein lies the problem here. And I take it from your report that you believe that in essence the process was not bad. The process should have worked. Is that what your conclusion?
That is our conclusion. The process is there.
And it should work.
And it should have worked, yes, sir.
Secondly, I take it from your conclusion that you really don't find that there's something wrong with the people. The people that were in those jobs had the right qualifications, they had distinguished acquisition careers, and they were the kind of people who you would have thought would do the job correctly. Is that not true?
I certainly believe that, and you know, in contemplating this action, Mr. Chairman, I, of course, mulled this over for a long period of time, and we often criticize quickly. You look at the records of these individuals, and they certainly were those who you would think would be in those positions. Together, they had 42 years of acquisition experience, and they did have the qualifications. I think what we were dealing with here, at least as I have concluded, were errors in human errors in judgment.
And you also, I take it, believe that the information was not, the information was available, that was not the problem, that there was information available that should have alerted the proper people that something was wrong. Is that?
There was raw data.
that should have convinced people that was something was going on here.
That we received from the contractors, as Mr. Beach pointed out in his report, for a number of months, that properly analyzed and properly reported should have alerted not only those in the program management, but those in my position, for example, as the acquisition executive at the time, that we had a serious problem developing.
And so then let me try and understand what went wrong. What exactly caused the problem? And I guess at several points, I mean, just reading through the report, at several points there were some hints that something was going wrong, but the information was never run to ground, if you see. I mean, the cost analyst working for the program manager, it seemed to me, and I'm trying to remember from the report, somewhere in the March, June of '89 time frame, raised some red flags. Then I think in the fall of '89, the comptroller also raised some flags, and then of course there was the flags that were raised right at the time of the major aircraft review by Mr. Crystal. So at least 3 periods. Now the last one, of course, occurred too close to the major aircraft review. But basically, I take it the problem was that people just didn't run down the evidence. Is that what you're saying here?
The problem from my vantage point, Mr. Chairman, is we have developed over time, and as was pointed out by Congressman Island, over many years, we have developed a system that is almost, well, it's adversarial at the same time that it is a system that creates advocates. And it's a system that I find, not in all cases, but in some cases, it's very hard to push bad news up to the top. As we pointed out in the report, and I think the report does this very well, there was information that was there to indicate that there was a problem. But I have asked myself the same question, obviously, now over a number of months after these revelations came forward. And I conclude, and as simply as I can state it, I think that we have here an airplane which everyone, which is a very difficult airplane to build. It is very hard to manufacture. And going into this program, everyone believed, based on the engineering and the estimates that was done, that we could get from here to there. As we have traveled this road together, that is the contractors and the Navy, we find that there were problems that we did not anticipate. And this grew over a period of time. Now, I've gone back, as I said, and reflected upon the briefs that I've gotten. And at the early part of the program, as I recall, we had a weight growth problem, which is not at all uncommon in any aviation program that I'm familiar with, that I was always assured we had workarounds developed and we would get from here to there and the IOC would not be impacted. As it turned out, as you can see from Mr. Beach's report, those estimates early on were just far too optimistic.
Mr. Garrett, Secretary Garrett, explain to us, if you can, because there's a reference to a phrase that's an abiding cultural problem. That sort of stuck in my, as I read the Beach report there. What is the abiding cultural problem that we're dealing with here?
Well, I have, you know, I don't have as much experience as some of the members of the committee and certainly the staff in this particular arena. But my experience over the last 6 years, since I've been in the Department of Defense, is exactly what I alluded to. We have created either, and I think quite inadvertently, an adversarial system, not only between the two branches of government from time to time, but within our own organization, where people are very reluctant if in fact they think that their program is going to be harmed, that is, they are going to be impeded in their ability to manage that program, then they bring forward, they, if you will, put the best face on the situation that is at hand. I have looked at it in the context of the people. As I said, these are very highly qualified people. We have many of them in the department. They are not trained to fail. They are trained to succeed. And in this case, these gentlemen have had very successful careers over a long period of time. They are not used to failure, and they probably in this case chose not to, at the proper time, admit that we've got a very difficult problem. And it's that adversarial nature, that situation where if I come forward with bad news, the comptroller's going to jump on me and wreck my program. So I'm going to work that problem, and I'm going to come forward with a solution. And that, I think, Paul, you may wish to elaborate, but I think that to me is the cultural problem that we're working with.
So it's a combination of the fact that the program managers, of course, become advocates for their program because they and the contractors are trying to work this thing, plus the concern about sending forward bad news, because if you send forward bad news, it's going to have an impact on your program, your money's going to get cut, or something's going to happen. Either Congress is going to do it, or the comptroller is going to do it, etc.
Or the Secretary of the Navy might do it. I don't put money against bad programs very often, because I suffer the same consequences, as you know, and as a manager, I see that as part of my responsibility to the American people, is not to throw good money after bad.
Ron Dellums.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first, Mr. Secretary, address a question to Mr. Beach. In your findings and recommendations, you know, you're fairly technical. Let me ask you to give me as simple an answer to this question as you possibly can. Given the fact that this program, had very little, if any, so-called micromanagement from the Congress of the United States, B, had personnel with exemplary, certainly extraordinary credentials, and C, this is a program that did not lack for funds. It was indeed fully funded. So you had all three of the so-called positive factors: good staff, fully funded, no micromanagement from the Congress, so you didn't have this so-called adversarial situation in this particular program. Tell us, how did we get to this moment?
Mr. Chairman, I would evaluate it, I think, and go back to the end of my report where I sort of used the phrase that Chairman Aspen used with the Secretary a moment ago about a cultural problem. Certainly it is correct, and I described it at some length in the report, that there was no micromanagement of this program, that the individuals who were in charge of the program management team are, by all accounts, as well qualified as one could ever want. Nonetheless, the problem that I confronted as I looked at the evidence was that as information moved up the program management chain, judgments and estimates about what that information reflected in terms of the program's status and its prospects tended to get more optimistic. Bad indicators tended to be downplayed, good indicators tended to be accentuated. And we must understand, and I wouldn't want anyone who's not had the opportunity to read the report fully to think otherwise, that this was not a situation where there was no display of any of the challenges in the program. The challenges in the program from the technical side and on the manufacturing side were articulated and articulated and discussed quite thoroughly, especially during some of the briefings on the major aircraft review. But the implications of them in terms of cost and schedule performance of the contract were consistently portrayed in an optimistic light. I was confronted with the problem of figuring out how well qualified, good people with the kinds of experience and training that these people have could do that. The inference that I drew based on the evidence available to me was that, notwithstanding the fact that there was no micromanagement and notwithstanding the full funding, there was an aversion to displaying risk to the higher levels of the system, where that display of risk might create adverse consequences for the program. So I can only attribute it to a process of risk aversion on the part of people who have to manage these programs, and a focus that is centered on the program itself, and perhaps not as much as it needs to be on the broader interests of the department and of the senior decision makers who have to allocate resources to make sure that the entire program is balanced. I know that's not a simple answer, but it's not a simple problem.
I appreciate that. As you recall, in my opening statement, I asked the question of whether or not a number of people in charge of this program, responsible for the program, became so wedded to the success of the A-12 program that it blinded their capacity to see what we now realize are obvious failures, problems, etc. Is your answer to that question yes, that was an integral part of the problem?
Yes, sir. I think that's very much part of it, and I was struck by that as I listened to your opening statement. As Secretary Garrett has indicated on many occasions, naval officers and indeed officers, I'm sure throughout our military, are trained to succeed. And the question becomes one of judgment. When should you realize that the problem is bigger than you are, as opposed to continuing valiant efforts to overcome the problem? And it was my conclusion that these officers made that judgment and made it wrongly in this case.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary.
We've heard a lot of testimony about the responsibility of individuals in the Navy for creating a misleading picture of the A-12 program. What measure of responsibility do the contractors have for the rosy picture of how well the A-12 is coming along?
Well, sir, I think they share certainly in the responsibility that we in the Navy have. We are stewards, as are we all, of the resources that the American people give us. As far as I'm concerned, while technically they have a contract with the United States Navy, they really have a contract with the American people. So they are equally responsible in this endeavor.
Well, does the responsibility go as far as progress payments and other things that the Department of Navy or the Department of Defense have the right to halt, debarment, anything? I mean, you know, I don't know, and I'm not suggesting, but I mean, what?
I think
what part do they? You've already said what you're going to do with the Navy people.
Well, we're still working with the contractors, Congressman Sisiski. One of the things that I did when I first learned of this, I mean, when I discovered the problem, I took what I thought was quick and decisive action to inform the system, the Secretary. I held those responsible, accountable for their actions, and we set about, first of all, to get our hands around the program. That is, determine exactly to the best of our ability where we were, technically and otherwise. And the Navy Acquisition Executive concluded his critical design review and came to me and said, technically, I think there are no showstoppers. The second aspect of our inquiry then was to address the issue of accountability, to answer some of the questions for ourselves from the management side of the House. What went wrong? What happened? Why are we here? And believe me, had I known what I knew on the 1st of June, at some point prior to that, we wouldn't be here today.
Would the gentleman yield,
Sure.
so I could follow up on this general area? Mr. Secretary, did the program manager ever attempt to pass along the bad news to the senior civilian leadership within the Navy outside his own direct military chain of command?
There is one instance, of course, that's reflected in Mr. Beach's report that came up in May of 1990 when all of this train was moving pretty fast, Congressman Skelton, and the contractors had come into him, I think, on the 4th of May and had laid on the table, essentially, the fact that we have a major, major problem. At that point in time, the program manager attempted to convince his leadership, his military leadership, that this information should be brought to the attention of the Navy Acquisition Executive, and it was not. And that was a conscious decision for which I took the action I did.
Thank you. I appreciate you yielding.
Do you know whether or not the contractors are having their own investigation of this, senior management of how this?
I don't know specifically, Congressman Sisiski. I know that Undersecretary Betty has asked them to go and review the same things that we have reviewed. I am not sufficiently knowledgeable.
One last question, which I think is very important. It is my understanding, and I don't know if this is correct or not, that the original A-12 was designed to have a minimum of changes once various contracts were awarded. Were the cost overruns a result of contractor problems in meeting the original design specifications, or did the contractors have problems with subsequent Navy changes in the baseline contract? Do you know?
I believe that they had problems meeting the original specifications, which were very difficult. I mean, they were difficult specifications to meet. And as I said, we know how to build metal airplanes. We don't quite know how to build composite aircraft as well as we do metal airplanes. This is a difficult airplane to build. We did not change our requirements in the Navy.
You did not change your requirements?
No, sir, and I think I would know if in fact they had, because we have a system within the Department of the Navy where we call it a program management proposal or program change proposal, that if in fact one is proposed, it comes to the Secretary of the Navy for approval. That's how we try to stop what used to be called gold plating.
One further question, Mr. Chairman. This is a fast one, really. In the original bid, how much different was the bid between the loser? There were 3 of them in that bid. Do you remember?
I would have to take that.
Was it a large amount, a small amount?
I would have to take that question for the record. It's been some time, and I honestly don't remember what the spread was, sir.
Wasn't the program manager for this, was he? That would be the other bottom line, I guess, we would hear for this thing. You know, I can't really even get outraged anymore. You know, I was telling Ron Dellums just the other day, we were talking about this thing. 1982, it was spare parts. Then the contractors were boarding dogs at kennels, and we were paying for it. And then we went from there and we went to the Joint Chiefs of Staff reform, where we were told we were un-American because we wanted to pass it. Then we went to the 688, and we couldn't get rid of General Dynamics because they were the only ones that could build ships. And then we went through the B-1. We were told it was the greatest system, only to find out it. Now we know we can't even put a conventional bomb on the thing to use it over in the Middle East. Then, of course, not even to mention the B-2, and we talk about whether there's a systemic problem. The black programs have gone from $5 billion to $25 billion in the period of the 80s. And each one of these programs, we're moving farther and farther along. And, but it's like a wake. This is the way I think about this today. You know, we all come into the hearing room. We all have our heads down, and the body is laid out somewhere in the corner, and we hold each other's hands. And we shake our heads, and wasn't it a tragedy? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Then what happens is you guys get back in the car here, and you'll think about this, because you'll remember this, because you'll do this, and you'll say, how do you think it went? And then you'll call up here, and you'll say, how did it go? And then you'll talk about it, and then you'll say to yourselves, are things bad enough, or do you think maybe we can just full steam ahead, damn the torpedoes, and let's just get on with the program? They'll all forget. I don't want to kick you when you're down. Okay, I don't want to do that, Larry. I mean, we've had these secretaries of the Air Force and Navy. You know, everybody's come up here to all testifying. I remember the MX program. John Rowland came out in the hallway. I said, John, is there a problem with the MX? He says, well, if you consider the fact that we don't know whether it'll hit the Soviet Union or Hartford, Connecticut, I guess we got a problem with it. So it's just been consistent. My feeling is the only way we can deal with this is and this is what the public's saying, this system just stinks. I mean, we have to do something. It's up to us to do something. I mean, a program like the A-12 has just simply got to be canceled. I mean, you just can't reward people for this. I mean, I don't know what all the implications are. Norm says, you know, are you prepared to do this? And I'm not advocating it. I'm advocating dramatic change. Because the only thing that's going to get anybody's attention, because we'll just, you know, we can't keep the heat on, and then this program will just, it'll seem to live. And I'm told this is just a paper airplane now. I mean, it really isn't even a real deal. Let me ask you a couple questions. Number one, Larry, when the contractor filed for progress payments are a thing, by the way, that I have opposed from the standpoint of how much you give for years. I don't think it squeezes people enough. In the area of progress payments, have we in fact made payments based on progress that has not occurred?
If I may, Congressman, to speak to that, the nature of over-progressing, the term that I used earlier and that's used in the report, is that the payments are made reflecting greater progress than was actually made under the contract at the time of the payment. And our initial review on site out at the end of July raised that specter, and I understand that that's been subsequently confirmed by DCAA audits.
Well, that then means, I remember when we passed the contractors reform, we put all these things in there. In fact, John Bryan had an amendment to throw the CEO in jail if somebody out in some city you know, did something goofy. We passed that in the House, by the way, but pulled it out of the conference committee, which made sense. But we have some pretty tough laws in there when it comes to overhead. I think that we have some pretty tough things in the law when it comes to progress payments. So the first question would be, does the Navy plan to file under the False Claims Act some kind of charges against those people who certified that progress was made and they were then paid for progress that never occurred.
I think it's fair to say, and Paul, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the inquiries into this particular aspect of this case continue. I mean, there is a DCAA audit that is ongoing. I know there is other action that is ongoing, and as soon as we have the facts together, I will act in the same way that I have acted thus far. And I would, if I may... If
the evidence comes back that in fact progress payments were made based on progress that didn't occur, would you then personally tell this committee that you will file a suit under the False Claims Act against the contractor?
I will tell you, I can tell you today that I will take whatever action is appropriate under the circumstances as the facts evolve. If I may, Congressman, first of all, just to elaborate, you know, I've thought about this issue too in the context of what you said about what has gone on in the past. Again, you know, at the beginning of the hearing, the question was what went wrong, and I think it's important that we not lose sight of the fact that we have taken on a significant technological challenge here, not only in the context of the airframe, but in the context of the manufacturing processes that are brought to bear. And if you look back over time, while we have had these difficulties before, we oftentimes get from here to there. Now, granted, we may not get there in the way that we originally thought we would, or in the context of the dollars that we thought we would. But we have produced, I think, an awful lot over time that is worth producing. And I believe, in my opinion, when you look at what we have in the fleet today, and you look at what these young men are flying over in the Persian Gulf, I mean, we're flying airplanes that came online before the handheld calculator was put on the market. And this remains a valid requirement. And I've asked myself the question as we go back, you know, to the fixed price contract, the fixed price development contract, which I might add I have never been an ardent supporter of in the context that everything has to be fixed price. But I remember asking the question early on in this process, is this the proper vehicle? I asked it of my program people, I asked it of my other staff people, and was assured that the contractors understand the risk, and we think we understand the risk.
Well, is this part of the problem, Larry? The fact that you have a fixed price contract with a cap on it, which sends a message perhaps to auditors who say, well, if the thing doesn't work, the contractor will end up paying for it, without considering the fact that the contractor either can't pay for it or won't pay for it, or if in the process of paying for it destroys their financial integrity, which jeopardizes the program.
Clearly, in my opinion, Congressman, that is a part of the problem. I mean, these are big boys we're dealing with. You know, this is not a small issue. And certainly on the program management side of the House, I think as Mr. Beach points out, there was in the minds of those who were managing the program this belief that we have a fixed price contract. The contractors are legally obligated and have committed to produce for the United States Navy and the American people an airplane that we have laid out in the specification. So there was, if you will, this sense of security that we are still within the bounds of the four corners of this document. And if we were on a cost-plus contract, I don't think we'd have the problem, you know, in the context
well,
of...
Well, you did, if I may, will the gentleman yield?
Sure, certainly.
There was a 60-40 split in here for target to the ceiling, and I've looked at other programs. If this was so risky, I think the C-17 was an 80-20.
Well,
and if this is the breakthrough here, I can't comprehend how big boys, you used it,
yes, sir,
would accept a highly technical problem there with a 60-40 split on a fixed price. I don't understand it.
Well, I remember, if my memory serves me correct, Congressman Sisiski, when I became the Undersecretary, the acquisition strategy had essentially been laid out, and we went from a fixed price contract to a fixed price incentive contract with a 60-40 split. And that's when I asked the question, is this the appropriate vehicle, gentlemen? Is the risk understood? And the answer was yes, and I approved it going forward.
Let me ask, I just have one or two more short questions, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask you, Larry, I am of the philosophy that somebody said, I think it was Ike, put a medal on somebody. I think medals and plaques and birthday cakes and pats on the back are all great. But when you put, I believe in the old-fashioned bounty hunters. When you put money in people's pockets, that means a lot more to them than a plaque on the wall. the system broke down. I mean, the program manager, the major aircraft, it's just unbelievable. Garrett, your staff, Betty's staff, the NAVPRO, the AVPRO, the DCAA. I mean, the DCAA didn't do their job. Somebody along this chain of this path here should have stood up and said, this thing doesn't work. Now, Ernie Fitzgerald stood up and said it, and he had to get a court order to go to work in the Pentagon. So isn't there a way so that you, as a decision maker, are going to get information from somebody that's going to walk in your office and tell the truth? I'm amazed at these former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who on Monday go all along with whatever administration says, and then on Tuesday they're standing on the highest roof they can find screaming their disagreement with the administration. Maybe they get speaking fees in the process, I don't know. But how do we give people courage to stand up and blow the whistle and walk in your office or call Les Aspin or Ron Dellums or Andy or Norm or me and say this program stinks? How do we build that into the system? And it can't all be negative like Mr. Beach says. What positive thing can we build in there? So I want to introduce it if there is something.
That's an issue that I think we have, certainly I believe that I have begun, and I want to again stress that I have not been the recipient of only good news over the last 4 years. I have many program managers and many program people who come into my office and have come into my office and said, Mr. Secretary, we have a serious problem, and here's what it is. And we would sit down and work the issue, and I point out the D5, and I can point out other programs that we have had problems, and we have made what I consider to be reasonable management decisions to get the program back on track. Unfortunately, these negative incentives are a part of that in this particular instance. I went from the time I was the Undersecretary, Congressman Kachis, I took one position, and that was that I will assume that my people are capable and competent, and in almost all respects they have rewarded me in that regard. I told them that I would endeavor to ensure that they were capable of having the authority commensurate with the responsibility that was inherent in their office. But in fact, if they did not perform, then I would hold them accountable, and that's what I did in this case.
Mr. Chairman, I would hope that we could get, I would like to personally request from the staff what the alternatives are for us to cancel this A-12 program, zero out the funding for this next year, and explore the alternatives, which I'm sure you're going to do. And the last question I want to ask you is, I have a bill in, Larry, that eliminates the classified programs. Once we reach a $50 million threshold, the program sees the light of day, and we scrub it down. We don't go to the Intelligence Committee and have all these guys with stars and slideshows and all this pressure to make decisions. That it comes into the oversight of the Congress at a $50 million level. I wanted to offer that last time, but I had this other program I was working on, so I'm going to focus my attention this time to do it. And I wanted to know if you would favor a major restructuring and a major change of the way in which we deal with classified programs after this experience. And please don't tell me no.
Will you give me some time to think about the question and get back to you?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you.
Larry, let me ask one final wrap-up question here. Basically, it comes back to the question we're going to ask the next witness, Susan Crawford, about the progress payments, because that, as you say, has not yet been resolved as to what exactly has or has not been overpaid on the progress payments. But tell me what would have been different had we had the right information gotten to the right place earlier. If we would have had earlier knowledge of the true state of the FSD contract, would that have made a difference, and what difference would it have made?
In my opinion, Mr. Chairman, it would have made a difference. At that time, early fall or a year ago, I would have been the acquisition executive. I was putting together the budget for 1991, 1992. I would have sat down with the program people. I would have notified the Secretary of Defense and the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition that we had a problem, and I would probably have come forward with them recommending a restructure of the program, recognizing the realities, both technical as well as otherwise, and put money in, not put the kind of money that we're talking about into the program simply because the facts of life were that we weren't going to get from here to there in the time frame that we thought. So it would have made a difference. from the point of view of managing the department and the program.
So the cost of having this information lag or information disconnect here is really both perhaps on progress payments, yet to be determined, but also on a delayed reaction to restructuring the program and getting a better program from the Navy standpoint.
Possibly, or taking other actions as we took in the P7 program. I mean, the point is we are charged, as you know, by you and by our oath to manage these programs and manage the department in a way that makes sense. And that's what we do, and of course, we can only do it in most instances with the facts that come before us. And in this case, the full facts did not come forward until early June, and we acted.
Secretary Garrett,